Why investing in infrastructure for the United States is a good investment?
I think the key right now is we need to rebuild the economy in a lot of different areas, in the roads, the bridges, digital, in the plans for infrastructure, but we ought to pay for that going forward. And that's really where the debate in Washington is now. Washington, as you know, has not thought about anything but tax cuts for basically 40 years, and President Biden's putting some tax increases on the table, and he's finding resistance actually in both parties. The Republicans are saying we're not going to raise $1 to reverse the 2017 corporate tax cut, which was a sheer giveaway, raise the budget deficit, and many Democrats are saying we don't want this tax raise. We don't want that tax raise. We want to end the deductions on the state and local taxes. So the big question for us is whether we're going to actually pay for what we need in the United States. That's the drop.
Between the Trump tax cuts for the top 1% and the pandemic, billionaires have increased their wealth exponentially, and now the inequality in the United States is even worse. Jeffrey Sachs, top Cambridge economist, tells us we need to invest in infrastructure, and we need to invest in it now. We need to spend money on the right things, and infrastructure is it. The thing is, we have to understand how the money's being spent and why it's a good investment.
First of all, I think all these numbers are very hard for people to process, because when they announce a number like a $2 billion package, the first thing you have to do is look over how many years and divide by that to get the idea of what's the real annual spending. Then you have to divide that by the size of our economy, which is $20 trillion a year. What they're talking about is 1 or 2% of our national output. It's not very large. And the tax increases are not very large either. But when it's put in these big headlines, then people can think it's over the top. We simply haven't patched our infrastructure, much less modernized it, for decades. We haven't done other than tax cuts for decades. The truth is the American people, the average person, overwhelmingly supports the higher taxes on companies and on wealthy people, usually by a margin of about 70% in favor or 75% in favor to 20% opposed. What's going on in the White House behind you is the lobbying. We have powerful, rich people who are opposing any contribution that they might make. We have mega corporations that don't pay any taxes, and they want to keep it that way. We have an IRS that had its budget cut so much that it doesn't do audits anymore. So this is a game that's going on. The American people, by and large, see through the game, but Washington often doesn't care. They don't care about that game. The game that they're in is the campaign contributions. So my sense is that we need to modernize. We need to upgrade our technology. We need to get to 5G digital. We need to get to clean energy. We need to repair roads and bridges. And the price tag is absolutely affordable, but the greedy companies and greedy, very rich people who've gotten a lot richer in the last 2 years with the soaring stock market need to get onto the program. That's my feeling.
Because you heard the Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell say he's not going to support anything that raises taxes from the tax cut that was approved in 2017 during the Trump presidency. How's all this going to be paid for if they're not going to increase some taxes?
Well, that's right. I mean, they do want to raise taxes, but they want to raise regressive taxes, taxes on working families. I come from a very rural state. People drive long distances to get to work. Apparently, McConnell wants those folks, working people, to pay more in taxes. I want large corporations, some of them that haven't paid a nickel in federal income tax last year, and the wealthiest people in this country to start paying their fair share of taxes. So that is a fundamental divide. The other divide is what we consider to be infrastructure. In my view, it is not just roads and bridges, but it is the foundations of a modern society.
Right now, we're looking at low interest rates, and the rich use other people's money that they can get at low interest rates and spend it to make more money. And that's what the United States needs to do too. We need to spend money at a low interest rate to make more money and invest in our country and invest in infrastructure. And as John Oliver explains it, this isn't such a scary investment as you may think. It's actually good.
The truth is, our national debt is undeniably big, and between the trillions in coronavirus stimulus bills and the infrastructure plans Biden unveiled just this week, it's poised to get even bigger, and Republicans in particular seem outraged by that.
This chart showing debt is not just about the big number. It's not just about the $30 trillion of debt. This is about tyranny.
History is screaming this warning at us. Countries that bankrupt themselves and destroy their economies simply aren't around very long.
There will be a day of reckoning.
But if we have huge clocks to measure it, we're considering an infrastructure bill that can add $2 trillion to it, and some are implying that our creditors could be turning up any day now with a baseball bat to repossess our bridges and dams because of it. We thought tonight might be a good time to talk about the national debt, how it works, how valid concerns about it are, and how we should think about it moving forward. And let's start with the basics, like the difference between the debt and a deficit. A country runs a deficit when it spends more money on things like the military, social programs, and everything else the government does than it brings in, mostly through taxes. Now, to pay for a deficit, the government then borrows money, thus accruing debt. So the deficit is a yearly measurement of how much we're in the red, and the debt is the total amount that we owe accumulated over time. And for decades in political ads, the debt has been portrayed as a burden that we're placing on future generations, basically making that argument that we are running up their credit card and that one day the bill's going to come due.
Allegiance to America's debt and to the Chinese government that lends us money.
But for the record, the majority of government debt is actually owned by American investors. For example, if you have a pension, you might own some of that debt in the form of government bonds because they're a pretty safe investment. Foreign investors only own around a third of our debt. And while, yes, it is true, China does own over $1 trillion of it, which isn't nothing, it's around 5%. For what it's worth, they're not even our largest foreign creditor, Japan is. And while the debt is often talked about as being something that we're running up with new spending, the truth is, before the pandemic hit, most of our debt was the result of long, steady growth in programs that we'd long ago committed to, like Medicare and other entitlements. So we are very much getting stuff for the money that we're spending. And that actually brings us to a really important point here. Going into debt can actually be a good investment for the country. Essentially, as economists will tell you, the key question is, are you spending money on the right thing? The point is, Republicans love to argue that government should be run like a business, but tend to conveniently forget that some extremely valuable companies got that way in part because they had long periods where they spent a shitload more than they took in. And it is worth taking a moment to look at the history of the debate over the national debt, because the argument the Republicans often make is that they are the responsible ones who want to reduce the debt and rein in spending, whereas Democrats just love recklessly throwing around money. But that story just doesn't match up to reality. Take Ronald Reagan. He spent years complaining that deficits were a sign that the federal government had simply lost its way.
I think the answer to curing inflation is a balanced budget.
But the key thing to know is that Reagan didn't, in fact, end up spending his presidency saying no, because he wasn't really promising not to spend money so much as promising not to spend it on certain people. His campaign rhetoric about welfare queens played into the racist trope that black people were fraudulently benefiting from wasteful government spending. And as president, he followed through by making cuts to basic elements of the social safety net, like food stamps, welfare, and Medicaid. But he also massively increased defense spending while cutting taxes so that the government took in less money, creating large deficits that wound up tripling the national debt, which I guess in his terms made Reagan America's hottest little slut. Then came these two guys, and between Bush Sr. and Clinton, they more or less did what Reagan had promised to do, cutting spending and raising taxes enough to achieve budget surpluses by the end of the 90s. And the debt was briefly starting to come down until this lovable little human rights violation entered the picture, because he immediately signed a massive tax cut and launched an expensive war on terror, and then signed a second round of tax cuts, all of which made our national debt explode. But Republicans, strangely, didn't seem to give a shit until, that is, Obama became president. He inherited a historic recession and immediately signed a large stimulus bill, but afterwards was met with fervent opposition to any additional spending, mainly from Republicans, who had suddenly refound their hatred for deficits. And sometimes they expressed it in truly remarkable ways.
Our free stuff today is being paid for by taking money from our children and borrowing from China. We are going to be beholden to a foreign master.
Yeah, no, that's just not how any of that works. The debt isn't going to just suddenly come due all at once, and being in debt to someone is not the same as being enslaved by them. Republicans putting the brakes on Obama's recovery spending is now widely considered to have been a big mistake. Most experts agree that the federal government didn't spend as much on stimulus as it should have following the financial crisis, forcing state and local governments into austerity that delayed the economic recovery by about 4 years. He campaigned on eliminating the entire national debt, only to then implement an absolutely massive tax cut, resulting in huge deficits. Most corporations who benefited used the money not on investments in things like factories, but on stock buybacks. As for individuals, nearly half the tax cuts went to the top 5% of income earners. So we gave more money to people who already had a lot of it. And despite claiming that Trump's tax cuts would pay for themselves, they very much did not. In fact, they did so little to boost the economy, they're projected to cost us $1.9 trillion over a 10-year period, all of which clearly left some fiscally responsible Republicans who voted for those tax cuts in a pretty awkward position.
You belong to a party that has greenlit a historic expansion of deficits and debt. And it's just a plain fact.
We are still left with the key question, how much debt is too much? And the interesting answer to that is, nobody really knows. For many years, we thought that the best way to measure debt was to compare it to the gross domestic product, basically measuring how much in total the country owes versus how much it produces each year. And the economic consensus was that debt exceeding GDP, or even getting close to it, was a hard red line that could not be crossed without risking a financial crisis. But it's much more complex when it comes to our economy too, because something fascinating happened around last June. Largely because of increased borrowing resulting from the first round of COVID stimulus, our national debt actually surpassed the size of our GDP. None of them happened. It didn't suddenly cost us a lot more to borrow money due to higher interest rates. We didn't, as you may have noticed, become Greece. In fact, despite adding $4 trillion to the debt last year, interest payments on that debt actually declined. And that isn't even a one-off. As our debt has risen in recent years, interest rates have fallen to historic lows. So, what is the reason for that? The Budget Office has now said that the debt to GDP ratio has no set tipping point where a financial crisis is imminent. So, taken together, all of this has made many economists start changing the way that they think about debt, thinking that, very basically, so long as our economy grows at a rate greater than the interest that we're paying on our debt, we can come out ahead. In kind of the same way that you would come out ahead if you borrowed money at 2% interest and then invested it somewhere and got 5% returns. But the larger point is, this whole field is in a bit of flux right now. Some economists believe that we should not get too complacent, that a debt crisis is still on the horizon, just not at the tipping point that we previously thought. The point is, there is a good faith debate to be had over how to handle our national debt over the long term. But right now, most economists actually agree that with interest rates at historic lows, the question shouldn't really be how much debt are we taking on, as much as what is the value of what we are getting for it in return. And there are certainly dumb fiscal decisions that we could make, like tax cuts for the rich. We've tried that multiple times now, and if they were the magic key to eliminating our debt long term, we probably would have seen signs of it working by now. But there are smart financial decisions that more than justify going into debt, like spending on social programs, infrastructure. Amidst the current crisis that we're in, many experts are less concerned about us spending too much than spending too little. And if it turns out that inflation or interest rates do start to rise, we should absolutely start cutting deficits, although not by cutting government programs that people need, but through taxing people who can afford it. Look, no one credible is saying that deficits don't matter or that we should borrow as if the sky is the limit. What they are saying is the debate shouldn't be about whether debt is good or bad. It should be about whether the investments that we are making are worth it or not. And if you are still worried about debt because you've been told that you are burdening your children and children's children's future, well, I actually have some good news for you, because those future generations have a special message just for you.
Hello! Hello! Hey there! We are your children, your grandchildren,
And your great-grandchildren.
and we have a message for you.
Stop using us to scare people about the national debt.
You idiots clearly have no idea how it even works.
Use debt to build new roads and bridges.
Which we'll need to drive on. You can use it to improve schools, which would make us into a more skilled labor force.
You can use it to improve healthcare so we can be healthier and more productive. Debt can be a tool for growth. In fact, the debt to GDP ratio isn't as reliable a metric as previously assumed.
We're so concerned about our future.
Maybe it's worth spending now on things like preparing for the impacts of climate change. The clock is really ticking on that one. Please!
Believe us when we say
We're not as scared of being born into debt
as we are of being born into a country that didn't invest in our future.
Those of us at Smart Health Talk are saying, let's invest in America. Let's invest in our future. Let's invest in our infrastructure. We can do this.